He played the part, donned the badge, and made millions of people laugh. Beneath his charming charm and rural accent, however, was a reality that Ken Curtis had never dared to reveal until now. His secret confession came to light years after Gunsmoke had disappeared from television screens. And it dispelled all the fans' preconceived notions. Was it remorse, shame, or a long-kept secret that at last slithered to the surface? This was a mask, not merely a character he played. And when it did fall, the truth beneath was more repulsive than anyone could have imagined. Let's go back to the Ken Curtis that the world fell in love with before we get to the confession, because knowing about his glory days gives everything that followed a completely different significance. The legend we believed we knew Ken Curtis is a familiar face to everyone who grew up watching vintage westerns. The only thing that most people associate with him is Festus Haggen, the unkempt, abrasive deputy from Gunsmoke. And let's face it, that part was enough to leave him in people's memories. In actuality, though, that was only one aspect of a far more unexpected character. Gunsmoke wasn't your average television program. It was a behemoth of culture. It lasted for 20 years in all. For millions of viewers, Dodge City's dusty streets became a second home, and its characters were more like family than made-up cowboys. The law was Matt Dillon. The charm was brought by Miss Kitty. What about Festus? Festus, however, stole the stage in his own peculiar manner. People loved him because he was genuine, even though he wasn't flawless. There wasn't even much action in some of Curtis's most well-known sequences on the program. These were the calm, unusual times that showed Festus's more profound side. He performs an ancient frontier ballad to a dying man in one episode, for example. Or when he takes on the role of raising a Dodge City orphan. His comedy had heart, and his eccentricities had a certain honesty. It was visible to viewers, and they never forgot it. This was the devoted sidekick, the legend that everyone knew, the singer with a history, the cowboy with a heart. Even though Ken Curtis wasn't initially a clear option, his journey to play Festus is a tale of unexpected turns and turns that permanently altered Gunsmoke's trajectory. The unexpected beginning of how he came onto Gunsmoke. Every casting choice should be accompanied by a great splash, a carefully thought-out statement, and a dramatic introduction for a show as iconic as Gunsmoke. However, Ken Curtis didn't make a big splash when he entered the Dodge City universe. Actually, one of the most subtly intriguing twists in TV history is how he got the part of Festus Haggen. Gunsmoke had already achieved enormous success by the early 1960s. After over 10 years of broadcasting, it had established itself as the mainstay of American television. Marshal Matt Dillon, played by James Arness, was a common sight in living rooms all throughout the nation. However, both the show and its actors were changing. There was a significant void left when Dennis Weaver, who portrayed the endearing Chester Good, chose to quit the series to work on other endeavors. Chester wasn't only a sidekick. The crowd had become accustomed to the rhythm he brought to the event. He would be difficult to replace. Ken Curtis now comes into play, but not in the way you may expect. Curtis was already well known in the film and television industries. He had been starring in John Ford's westerns, as we previously discussed, and had established a solid reputation as a dependable actor who could portray the cowboy character with comedy and grit. His relationship with Gunsmoke, however, was rather more intimate. He had collaborated with a number of individuals involved in the production and was close friends with James Arness. Even still, nothing was assured, despite such relationships. He didn't go through the normal audition process for Festus. Actually, when Ken initially came on the program, Festus wasn't even a character. In 1962, he made his first appearance on Gunsmoke as a guest star, portraying a totally different character named Kyle Kelly in the Us Haggens episode. It was intended to be an isolated incident, more like to another colorful individual visiting Dodge. However, there was something particularly noteworthy about Ken's performance. He wasn't making an effort. He wasn't portraying a Western outlaw in a cartoon. He contributed timing, depth, and that unique scratchy voice that seemed to belong on the frontier of Kansas. The audience took notice. The producers also did. Curtis had a special talent for balancing warmth and ruggedness. He was capable of handling action sequences, making incisive remarks, and adding just the right amount of quirky charm to draw you in. The show's creators decided to bring him back because of the overwhelming positive reviews, but this time they gave him a memorable name, Haggen Festus. Festus was a rough-and-ready cop. He wasn't the cleanest talker, or the fastest sketch. However, that was the main objective. Festus defied convention in a world when a lot of westerns were formulaic. He had a backwards logic that somehow always led to the correct solution, was sloppy, and was intelligent in his own way. Curtis took in everything. With his slouched gait, his raspy voice, and the kinds of facial expressions that made people grin without even realizing it, he molded Festus. Curtis, who was formally cast in 1964, did more than just take Chester's place. He completely changed the definition of a sidekick. Festus eventually gained the same level of popularity as Matt Dillon. He made the show more balanced. Festus had the ability to lighten the mood when things were too serious. You knew he could keep up when the action got more intense. Additionally, Ken Curtis has stated that he was inspired by a real-life figure named Cedar Jack, whom he had met as a boy in Los Animas, Colorado. The unique tone and demeanor that would characterize Festus were then cultivated by Curtis. Curtis's performance was a nod to Cedar Jack, a local character who was well known for his gritty personality. The idea that a character who wasn't even intended to be permanent ended up holding one of the longest-running positions in the history of the program is amusing. But that's what makes television so magical. Occasionally, a show's most memorable moments aren't included in the script. After a fantastic performance, they develop organically. Additionally, Ken Curtis did more than only portray Festus. Festus was his name, and it all began with one special guest appearance that grew into something far more significant than anybody could have predicted. However, Ken Curtis's adventure had already taken some unexpected twists before he even stepped foot in Dodge City, and it all began at a place that most people wouldn't think of. Let's go back. The route to Dodge. How it all started. Ken Curtis was a small-town lad with a voice that could stop you in your tracks, and an unquenchable drive, even before he became well-known or wore Festus's dusty boots on Gunsmoke. Ken was not born into the glamour of Hollywood or the glory of a cowboy. He was born Curtis Wayne Gates on July 2nd in the little town of Lamar, Colorado. He came from extremely humble beginnings. Dan Gates, his father, served as Bent County's sheriff. His performances would eventually reflect his upbringing in a tiny community with a strong emphasis on law and order. However, Curtis was only a little child at the time, pursuing wild ambitions outside. The plains were not a lovely place to live. There was dust in it, duties, as well as the relaxing days that allow children's imaginations to run free. He was raised on radio tunes and cowboy stories, and he frequently sang to himself while assisting around the house. People were aware of his deep emotional and silky voice even back then. He was more than a singer. He used singing to tell stories. Curtis chose to pursue his passion and his gift to Los Angeles after a brief time at Colorado College. Everything changed with that choice. Big band music dominated the radio in the 1940s, and Curtis's voice was a perfect fit for the time. He could croon with the best of them. He was deep, silky, and easily beguiling. And he did. His major break came when he became a vocalist for the renowned Tommy Dorsey Ensemble. This is when things start to get interesting. For a while he took Frank Sinatra's place as the band's main singer. Just think about that. There was a young cowboy at the microphone of the same band that made Old Blue Eyes famous. Despite not being as well known in the music industry as Sinatra, Curtis's time with Dorsey improved his abilities, exposed him to a wider audience, and demonstrated one thing. He could act in addition to having a lovely voice. He was charismatic and able to connect. Hollywood would eventually take notice, but Curtis wasn't satisfied with simply performing in front of the spotlight. He kept returning because of something about the Western way of life. The caps, the horses, and the open areas. And he met filmmaker John Ford, one of the most significant people in movie history, in the late 1940s. John Ford was more than simply a filmmaker though. When it came to westerns, he was the director. We are discussing the man who shot Liberty Valance, The Searchers, and Stagecoach. Ford recognized something in Curtis that went beyond the microphone, and the guy essentially created the genre. He recognized a natural storyteller, rustic charm and unadulterated skill. In 1950, Ken made his first appearance in a Ford movie, Rio Grande. Although he wasn't yet the star, he was able to compete with well-known actors like John Wayne. He portrayed sidekicks, scouts and warriors, each of whom he brought a little bit unique to the character. Audiences began to see that these weren't only little roles, but rather stepping stones. More significantly, Ford became more than just a mentor, he was family. Curtis never depended on name-dropping, but that relationship did open doors. Whether he was riding a horse and hunting outlaws or singing a love song, he always arrived on time, worked hard, and gave it his best. He possessed that unique combination of skill and diligence that subtly garners admiration in a noisy industry. You know, there's that aspect that people tend to ignore. Ken Curtis was already developing a strong filmography when Gunsmoke approached. He didn't become famous right away. He had to work his way up through modest film roles, singing engagements, and many days when he thought he would never be famous. But he stuck with it. His past seems almost too ideal in retrospect. A son of a sheriff who went on to become a singer, a cowboy actor and America's favorite television deputy. That's the problem with Ken Curtis though. Being famous was not his goal. He simply did the task. And the task took him to a unique place. Hollywood wasn't where his tale started. A child who loved to sing and didn't mind taking chances started it all in a little village. Ken Curtis never feigned being someone he wasn't, whether he was riding over Monument Valley in a John Ford movie or standing in front of a large band. He was genuine in every part and performance, and even when the limelight gradually came his way, he maintained his modesty. He wasn't only performing a part when he eventually arrived in Dodge City because of this. He was Festus, and the journey there was as interesting as the person he would grow into. However, Ken found himself entering a completely other arena just as everything appeared to be settling into a peaceful rhythm. One that was entirely focused on public debate and strong ideas, rather than scripts or cameras. Curtis was seen by some admirers as Dodge City's sane voice, the stern yet kind Festus Haggen on Gunsmoke. Behind his characteristic southern drawl and well-worn cowboy hat, however, Curtis was more than simply a Wild West mainstay. He saw that he was becoming more and more interested in politics, which is a little more unexpected, away from the television. Now, Curtis wasn't the type of famous person who made big political claims on press tours. His style simply wasn't that. He did, however, hold firm convictions, and he didn't hesitate to back the causes and people when the time came. He believed that his ideals were in line. The 1960s saw some of the first indications of this, a period of upheaval in American history. It was the Vietnam War. Political boundaries were being formed not just in Washington, but also in American living rooms, as the nation was rocked by the civil rights movement. In the midst of all of this, Curtis subtly backed Barry Goldwater in the 1964 presidential contest. Known for his conservative views, Goldwater wasn't exactly the most popular person in Hollywood. In an industry that often adopted a different position, supporting him was actually a rather daring decision. Didn't think it was daring, though. It seemed honest to him. Goldwater embodied an antiquated laissez-faire approach to governance that aligned with Curtis's traditional values and personal accountability beliefs. There was no PR stunt involved. He had no intention of upsetting anyone. He solely backed the candidate he thought was qualified for the position. A year later in 1965, Curtis and his co-star Milburn Stone from Gunsmoke got the exceptional chance to see the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library. That visit demonstrated Curtis's taciturn regard for American history and the figures who had influenced it, even though it lacked overt political overtones. Despite his lack of political clout, he was well aware of the direction the nation was taking. Then 1976 arrived. The country was still in shock over Watergate. People were searching for someone who seemed grounded and genuine, and their trust in politicians was at an all-time low. Curtis strongly supported Ronald Reagan during his bid for the Republican nomination that year. It was logical. Curtis was familiar with Reagan's combination of theatrics and homegrown appeal from his days in Hollywood. Both guys were able to relate to regular Americans via presence and storytelling rather than ostentatious words. This is when the exciting part begins. Curtis wasn't only giving out recommendations in private, he made appearances, traveled the campaign route, and spoke on favor of Reagan. He still didn't want to stir things up or give lectures, but he supported Reagan's principles: fortitude, hope, and faith in the potential of the United States. And he was aware that his voice had the power to change things. Curtis, however, never allowed politics to eclipse his identity. That was crucial. He didn't exchange his campaign buttons for cowboy boots. Politics was only one aspect of a much larger existence that extended well beyond TV screens and Dodge City. Even if he didn't agree with others' opinions, he never exploited his position to incite conflict. Regardless of their political stance, that is most likely the reason why so many of his supporters remained loyal to him. Curtis's political activity ultimately had nothing to do with pursuing fame or power, it has to do with principle. It was about backing the type of leadership he believed could safeguard the principles he was raised with and held in the highest regard. Like Festus, he too followed his instincts even when they weren't the most popular. Nevertheless, it is only the surface. Ken Curtis's truth was something completely different, and he kept it to himself for a very long time. Let's examine his personal life first, though. The nuptials and the man with the badge. Fans frequently imagine Ken Curtis galloping across the plains on Gunsmoke as Festus Haggen, wisecracking with a twang in his voice and a squint in his eye that wouldn't go away. Beneath his rugged appeal and on-screen toughness, however, was a man whose personal life took as many unexpected turns as any Western narrative he had ever acted in. From romances that were passionate but short-lived to partnerships influenced by Hollywood's heyday, Ken Curtis's marriage experience shows a more subdued and sensitive side of the icon. He had 3 previous marriages. Let's go back to 1943, when World War II was in full swing. America's pulse was big band music, and a young Ken Curtis, who was still more singer than cowboy, was only starting to settle into his professional and personal rhythms. Both were under contract at Universal Studios when he met Lorraine Page, his first wife, that same year. In general, hardly much is known about Lorraine. Perhaps that's intentional. Time and life on the road eventually put their love to the strain, but it was one of those intense and sensitive wartime romances. His early forays into Hollywood, such as his 1948 appearance as a featured vocalist and host on the country music radio show WWVA Jamboree, occurred around the time of this marriage. They divorced in 1950, nevertheless, as a result of the strains of their developing careers and the entertainment business. Their 7-year marriage didn't end in a tabloid splash divorce, no courtroom drama, no scandals. However, it quietly fell apart, as is often the case with partnerships, where one person is always pursuing a goal. Curtis's surroundings and himself were changing rapidly. In 1952, just 2 years later, Ken Curtis remarried. It wasn't just any love tale, though. This time, it was a member of the Hollywood elite. Barbara Ford, the renowned filmmaker John Ford's daughter, was his second marriage. John Ford was more than just a director, as anybody familiar with the golden age of westerns would know. He was the director, the one who influenced how the American cowboy was portrayed on movie. All of a sudden, Ken Curtis was no longer a budding actor, he belonged to the family. There were benefits to marrying into the Ford family, without a question. Working with John Ford opened doors that Curtis would not have been able to access on his own for years because he was a giant. This was more than simply a job shift, though. Curtis and Barbara truly cared for one another, shared adventures, expensive movie premieres, and perhaps a front-row seat were all hallmarks of their marriage, to the power dynamics of Hollywood. But after a 12-year relationship that began with promise and finally faded into oblivion, the pair were divorced in 1964, no public spectacle once more. However, many close to the marriage were aware that Curtis and Barbara could have become more distant. Despite his skills and growing notoriety, Curtis didn't want to live in the shadows of others, since life in the Ford family wasn't for everyone. Ken's third marriage was something very different from his first 2, which looked to be chapters from quite different books. Tori Connolly and Ken Curtis were married in 1966. Tori was not from the entertainment industry, as his prior marriages were. She wasn't a director's daughter, a celebrity, or a socialite. She was stable, grounded, and out of the spotlight. Perhaps that was just what Curtis needed, that point in his life. Because of Gunsmoke, he was well known at this point. Fans were falling in love with Festus, the tough, devoted, and endearing deputy sheriff, as his face appeared on TV screens all across the nation. Curtis, however, desired something a bit more realistic and serene off-camera. He got that from Tori. Their union was more subdued and intimate. They largely avoided the spotlight in their life, seldom ever going to major Hollywood events or spreading rumors to the media. And by all accounts, the collaboration was fruitful. Tori was not enmeshed in the glamour of show business, but she did support Curtis's efforts. She provided him with a level of steadiness he had never experienced before. There was no need for a divorce, because the couple stayed together for the remainder of Curtis's life. Not only are Ken Curtis's marriages noteworthy, but so is the manner in which he handled each one. He had no interest in making headlines. He kept his private affairs private. He fell, he learnt, he loved. And by the time he and Tori were married, it appeared that he had at last discovered a rhythm that fit the reserved, introspective person he was behind the scenes. Naturally, there were difficulties associated with being married to someone like Curtis. Being a part of a program like Gunsmoke required a lot of dedication and long hours due to the demanding filming schedules and the continual attention from fans. Tori, however, took it in stride. The way Curtis's personal and professional lives reflected each other is also lyrical. Festus was a contradictory character in Gunsmoke. He was tough on the outside yet passionately loyal, something of a recluse but always trustworthy. Ken too exhibited this dichotomy, the harmony between his public demeanor and his vulnerabilities. His marriages represented various stages of his life. Lorraine, the beginnings of optimism. The Hollywood chapter, Barbara. The silent solution, Tori. Suddenly you feel as though you know someone, especially someone like Curtis, who has been in front of the camera for decades. Something comes up that causes you to pause and consider what he was actually keeping hidden for all those years. What truth had he been holding inside, waiting for the proper time or occasion to finally speak? Ken Curtis eventually revealed the unpleasant truth after many years. You would think that all of the big names would be excited to return when a show as iconic as Gunsmoke got a reunion film. Gunsmoke was, after all, the Western, not just any Western. Its stars became household names and it created television history. Fans were therefore shocked to learn that Festus will not be saddling up for Return to Dodge. Curtis was where? What may have prevented him from joining the ensemble that shaped his career? As it happens, it wasn't just a matter of schedule issues or retirement, it was far more than that. People wondered for years. Perhaps he simply didn't want to reprise his role as Festus. Perhaps he thought he was too old. It might not have been personal. However, the true tale was boiling behind the scenes and it wasn't nice. Curtis, who is well known for his devoted following and rustic appeal, was not happy with the way the reunion film was being produced. And many were surprised when, years later, he eventually opened up. To begin with, remuneration was a major topic of disagreement. Festus, in Curtis's opinion, was a key figure, and merited compensation commensurate with their significance. According to producer John Mantley, Curtis wanted twice as much money as Amanda Blake was given. Due to Mantley's refusal, Curtis left the project. Therefore, it seemed like a slap in the face to be offered a salary that didn't represent that worth. According to reports, Curtis told John Mantley, the film's producer, to never call him again as their chat came to an end. Was that it? Completed. No space for discussion. That was how intense the argument had become. He drew a clear line in the sand after feeling mistreated. It wasn't only the pay though, the second blow was the script. Curtis was a man who was proud of what he did. Festus was more than simply the sidekick. Despite his peculiarities and comedic timing, he possessed layers, devotion, grit, and a keen sense of fairness. Curtis claims that he was unhappy with the modifications made to the original screenplay. Although he had accepted Jim Byrne's original version, he had taken issue with later changes. Curtis believed that the characters and the heritage of the program were not adequately represented in the updated screenplay. He declined to appear in the reunion film in part because of his vehement objection to these modifications. He felt that the reunion did not reflect the genuine meaning of Gunsmoke to the public. Instead of cashing the check and smiling as he rode out into the sunset, he decided to stick to his guns. It was noticeable that Curtis was not in return to Dodge, especially when other important characters were back. Doc Adams, played by Milburn Stone, was not replaced because he had died in 1980. The authors promoted Buck Taylor's character Newly O'Brien to the post of Dodge City Marshal in order to cover Festus's absence. You might be surprised by what happened to Curtis after everything had settled on Gunsmoke and the cameras had stopped rolling. Gunsmoke's last goodbye and life after him. Many people were curious about what would happen to the guy who made Festus Haggen famous after Gunsmoke. Life after Gunsmoke, if anything, demonstrated that Curtis had far more in store than anybody had anticipated. To begin with, Curtis never lost his passion for performing. After such a memorable performance, some performers leave the spotlight, but Curtis remained active on his own terms. Using the same voice that he had used to coo with large bands years before the world knew him as Festus, he went back to his musical origins. He reminded everyone that he was a vocalist who understood how to work a crowd long before he became a TV cowboy by performing at Western festivals, rural fairs, and rodeos. Even yet, television continued to call. He made a few cameos in television series such as The Yellow Rose and even provided his distinctive voice to the sneaky sheriff of Nottingham in Disney's animated classic Robin Hood. Despite being a light-hearted diversion from Festus, the character had that distinctive Ken Curtis vibe. Curtis has dabbled with production outside of entertainment. He worked on smaller film projects that allowed him to experiment with storytelling without being in the spotlight, demonstrating his willingness to get behind the camera and take a new approach to the creative process. It allowed him to maintain ties to the field he loved while establishing a position where he could make decisions as he saw fit. However, Curtis's trip ultimately came to an end, as is the case with many wonderful stories. After a protracted fight with heart illness, Curtis died quietly in his sleep at home in Fresno, California, on April 28, 1991. He was 74. Fans who had grown up with Festus's wild and crazy experiences were naturally heartbroken by his passing, but those closest to him took comfort in the knowledge that he passed away peacefully, surrounded by the love that had sustained him throughout his extraordinary life. Curtis's corpse was cremated after his death, and his ashes were dispersed among the plains of Colorado close to his hometown. Even though Curtis is no longer with us, his legacy endures. Audiences are still moved by his performances, whether they are given in front of a microphone or as the endearing Festus. In Clovis, California, a monument of Curtis in the role of Festus remains as a permanent memorial to the man who made the figure a reality. Through every repeat, every song, and every remembrance of that iconic voice that once reverberated across Dodge City, Curtis's narrative endures. Did pride stand in the way of legacy, or was Ken Curtis correct to leave the Gunsmoke where he was? Please share your opinions in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. Tap the next video on your screen to see more content like this.